My name is Aubrey Grant, and that evening was meant to be nothing more than a simple family dinner in Dallas. I still remember the chandelier's glow, the soft jazz, and how my father's voice filled the restaurant like an announcement no one could tune out. He raised his glass, grinning at my brother across the table. "Ryan's buying his first house," he declared proudly. "And I'm giving him $350,000 to make it happen." Applause echoed around us, forks tapped plates, and I tried to smile even as the air grew thick. My mother reached for her wine. Ryan leaned back, pretending to be humble, while the corner of his mouth twitched with smug pleasure. I stayed quiet, slicing my chicken slowly, waiting for it all to pass. Then my father turned to me, his tone soft but the impact sharp. "Aubrey," he said, "you'll cover this month's mortgage, right?" The table went still. Even the waiter stopped. I stared at my plate, at the clean cut I'd just made, and felt something inside me break along with it. Ryan laughed first but stopped when he realized I wasn't amused. My mother looked away. I set my fork down carefully, folded my napkin, and stood up. No one asked where I was going. Outside, Dallas shimmered gold through the rain-smeared car window. The city had never looked more alive, and my family never felt more distant. I started the engine and whispered to myself, that was the last dinner I ever stayed for. If you've ever been the one expected to fix what you didn't ruin, stay with me until the end. You might finally understand why silence can speak louder than words. Fairness never had a seat at our table. When I was a kid, our suburban Dallas home looked flawless from the outside. Trimmed lawns, fresh paint, an image of balance. Inside, though, everything revolved around my brother. Ryan followed Dad around the garage, learning to read market charts and calculate profits, while I was told to bring them lemonade or sweep up when they were done. He got lessons in confidence. I got reminders to stay useful. When Ryan made mistakes, Dad smiled and said, "Boys will be boys." When I slipped up the same way, he sighed and told me to be careful, as if I carried the family's image on my back. Mom always nodded along, insisting it was normal. That's just how families work. I learned to measure love by tone, not fairness, and silence became my routine. At school, Ryan's name carried weight because Dad's company sponsored events, while mine showed up only on the coffee shop schedule. He pulled up in a new car the day I started taking the city bus, and Mom waved from the porch as if that made it even. I'd watch them laugh through the window when I came home late, smelling of espresso and exhaustion. There was always a wall between their laughter and me. Every small win I earned, an A on a hard exam, a scholarship letter, was met with, "That's good." But stay focused. When Ryan got an internship, he threw a barbecue and everyone toasted to him. No one noticed I stayed in the kitchen washing dishes so the table would shine for his celebration. Mom once said, "You're strong like your father," but it never sounded like praise. It felt like a warning to endure quietly for everyone's comfort. I began saving early, hiding bits of cash from my part-time job in an envelope, promising myself I'd leave one day, somewhere the rules of comparison didn't exist. By senior year, Ryan's life was a portfolio of chances and support. Mine was a spreadsheet of shifts and bills. When he graduated, Dad gifted him a watch. When I graduated, I bought my own dress, signed my own loan papers, and took the bus to my ceremony because the car was being used for Ryan's interview. I stood in the crowd as the band played. The sun was hot, the pride in the air heavy, and none of it felt mine. My family clapped in the front row when Ryan's friend got an award. When my name was called, they clapped too, but it sounded automatic, rehearsed. For the first time, I didn't wait for their approval. I looked up at the stage lights and thought, this moment belongs to me. After graduation, Ryan took a trip to Miami, Dad's gift for his hard work. 2 days later, I started my first job at a small accounting office in downtown Dallas, wearing a clearance suit. On my first day, the manager asked why I wanted the job. I told him the truth. I wanted to build something that was mine. He smiled and said, "That's a good reason." ChatGPT said, "It was the first real compliment I could remember." That night, sitting alone in my apartment with the hum of traffic outside, I realized independence didn't come with applause or celebration. It arrived quietly, through every decision I made without anyone's permission. For the first time, I didn't feel invisible. I just felt free. That spring, Ryan turned 30. The party was hosted in a private dining hall downtown, draped in white linen and golden light, the kind of place that smelled like champagne and expectation. Most of the guests were Dad's colleagues, men in tailored suits who laughed too loudly and women with diamond bracelets that caught the chandelier's gleam. Waiters moved like choreography, balancing trays of oysters and wine. I arrived 15 minutes late, clutching a small silver-wrapped gift, a framed photo of our family from years ago, when laughter still sounded real. I'd hesitated over it, wondering if it would look out of place among luxury watches and engraved pens. Ryan stood at the center of the room, surrounded by admirers. His smile was polished, practiced, just like everything else about him. Mom waved when she noticed me, a brief flick of her hand, more obligation than joy. I placed the frame on the gift table, where it quickly disappeared behind gold boxes and ribbons. Then I found my seat at the far end beside a quiet accountant from Dad's firm, who nodded politely and returned to his steak. When the cake appeared, its candles glowing in perfect alignment, Dad stood and tapped his glass. The room stilled. He began to speak about legacy, work ethic, and pride in seeing his son grow into a man of ambition. Then, pausing just long enough for effect, he smiled and said he wanted to help Ryan start his next chapter with stability. A deliberate silence hung in the air before he announced he was gifting Ryan $350,000 for a new house. Applause erupted, sharp, immediate, like rain hitting metal. Camera flashes burst across the room. Someone whistled. Ryan feigned humility, glancing down before lifting his glass and saying, "Guess Dad's proud of me." The laughter that followed was thick with admiration. I stayed still, my hands resting on the napkin that wrinkled beneath my grip. I felt eyes turning toward me, waiting for my reaction. A smile, maybe a nod. But I kept my focus on the candles, their flames trembling with every flash, as if they too were struggling to hold steady. For a moment, I thought Dad would move on. But he didn't. He looked straight at me, his tone calm, almost casual. "Aubrey," he said, "you'll cover this month's mortgage, right?" The words dropped into the silence like a stone in still water. Conversation stopped mid-sentence. A waiter froze. Ryan's smile faltered, not from guilt, but surprise that Dad had shifted attention elsewhere. Mom's lips parted slightly, yet she said nothing. I wanted to ask if he was serious, but the answer was already there, in the certainty of his voice. The pause stretched. Someone coughed. Another filled their glass to fill the void. Finally, I stood. My chair scraped against the marble floor. My legs trembled, but my voice didn't. "I think I've celebrated enough," I said quietly. No one tried to stop me. Not Ryan, not Mom, not Dad. Outside, the rain had begun. Texas rain never falls softly. It pours like it's trying to wash everything away. I walked without an umbrella, my heels clicking against the wet pavement, the city lights bending into streaks of gold and white. My hair clung to my face, my dress heavy and damp, but I kept moving, each step louder than the last, swallowed by thunder overhead. Behind me, the restaurant windows glowed warm, filled with people who would forget this scene by dessert. Inside, they would laugh again, toast again, maybe even say my name with pity or annoyance. But out there, beneath the storm, something inside me shifted. The air smelled like rain and release. When I reached my car, I looked back once at the restaurant entrance, where the valet stood under the awning. The laughter inside rose and fell like a tide I no longer needed to follow. I unlocked the door, sat down, and stared at my reflection in the rearview mirror. My mascara had run, but my eyes looked clear. That night wasn't just my brother's birthday. It was the last time I belonged to their version of family. The morning after, I moved into a one-bedroom apartment near downtown Dallas. The walls were bare, the carpet smelled faintly of paint, and the only furniture was a folding table I'd bought from a thrift store. It wasn't much, but it was mine. I started working as a freelance accountant, taking contract jobs from small businesses that couldn't afford full-time help. Every invoice I sent felt like another step away from everything I used to know. The days melted into quiet rhythm, steady, simple, and finally, mine. I woke early, brewed coffee that tasted too strong, and opened my laptop at the same spot by the window. The sound of traffic below became a kind of rhythm that pushed me forward. I learned to live without the noise of others, without the pressure to perform. At first, the stillness felt strange. Freedom didn't roar. It whispered. One afternoon, during a corporate tax seminar, I met Derek Miller. He was a financial analyst who'd left his firm after refusing to manipulate client data. We started talking after the session, first about spreadsheets, then about values. He had a calm, steady focus that made people trust him. When I mentioned an idea I'd been sketching for months, a platform to help young professionals manage their finances and fund small projects, he leaned in and said, "That could actually work." A week later, we met again at a cafe on Main Street. Derek brought his laptop and a notebook filled with diagrams. "We'll call it Fair Fund," he said, explaining that the name stood for fairness and opportunity. His conviction made the idea feel real. That night, I registered the domain and drew the first wireframe. The next few months blurred into a cycle of work and exhaustion. I handled accounting, compliance, and outreach to small business clients. Derek built the interface and designed the investment model. Some nights we stayed in the office until dawn, eating takeout and coding beside half-finished mugs of coffee. On weekends, while the city slept, we built our first pitch deck. Dr. Patel, my old university friend, called one Friday evening after noticing my late-night messages online. She was now a therapist and insisted I meet her for dinner. "You sound like you're forgetting to breathe," she said. Over dinner, she listened as I described Fair Fund, how it consumed every corner of my life. She smiled softly and reminded me that purpose and burnout often wear the same face. That conversation reset something inside me. When I got home, I taped my rent invoice to the wall. It wasn't decoration, it was a reminder. Each month's number represented the cost of independence, not just in money, but in courage. The price of believing in yourself when no one else did. I began collecting them, one for every month I stayed afloat. As Fair Fund grew, so did a stability I'd never known. We reached 100 users, then 200. Small entrepreneurs began sending thank you messages saying they'd finally launched their projects because of us. Every note filled a space in me that family praise never could. I noticed changes in myself, too. I no longer checked my phone for apologies that would never come. The apartment still echoed when I closed the door at night, but it didn't feel empty anymore. It felt honest. By year's end, we were preparing to pitch Fair Fund to investors. Derek was confident. I was terrified but ready. That morning in the elevator, I caught my reflection in the mirror. I was no longer the woman waiting for approval, but someone who'd learned to build from absence. That evening, after the meeting ended with several investors showing interest, I walked home through the same streets I'd once arrived on months before. The city lights flickered like quiet applause. I didn't think of revenge or recognition. I thought of peace. The kind that comes from knowing you've started over and survived. A year later, Dallas looked smaller from my new balcony. The city lights shimmered beneath the night sky, their reflections dancing across the lake behind our home. The water was still as glass, catching the moon's silver glow. The house, $3 million of open modern space, didn't feel like a monument to wealth. It felt like proof that peace could exist, even after silence. Fair Fund had grown beyond anything I'd imagined. It was no longer a startup fueled by sleepless nights and borrowed laptops. After months of investor meetings, we'd secured full funding and expanded into 3 states. I was promoted to Chief Financial Officer, a title that once sounded foreign but now fit the life I'd built. My calendar filled with meetings and interviews, but my personal world stayed small, intentional. Quiet Alex Reed, my business partner, and now the man I shared this house with, stepped onto the balcony holding 2 mugs of coffee. He'd joined Fair Fund after the investment round, first as an advisor, then as something more. He understood calm not as silence, but as a choice. When I told him I wanted a home where mornings began with still water instead of traffic, he found this place. We signed the papers 2 months later. Inside, sunlight streamed through floor-to-ceiling windows each morning, painting soft gold across the walls. In my office, above the bookshelf, hung a simple frame. Inside, it was a wrinkled piece of paper, my first rent receipt from the apartment where I'd started over. The ink had faded, but the numbers remained clear. Whenever I looked at it, I was reminded of the nights I'd counted coins just to cover rent, the silence that had once felt hollow, but later became my strength. That paper held more value than any diploma or title. It was my symbol of freedom. My family hadn't spoken to me since that night at Ryan's party. Birthdays, holidays, career milestones, they all passed without a single word. At first, I believed the quiet would sting forever. I expected guilt or nostalgia to return, but instead it was replaced by calmness, a peace that endured. I stopped checking messages, stopped replaying old memories. Some wounds don't close because they're fixed, but because you stop visiting the place where you were hurt. There were nights when Alex would find me on the patio, watching the lake's reflections shimmer. The city skyline flickered in the distance, faint, as though it belonged to another lifetime of mine. One evening, after a long stretch of meetings, I told him I sometimes wondered if I had done enough to prove myself, if walking away had been too harsh. He studied me quietly for a while before saying gently, "You don't owe them proof. You're already living it." His words settled inside me like warm air after rainfall. It wasn't validation I'd been chasing all these years. It was understanding. Everything I had built, every quiet move, every sleepless night wasn't about revenge or approval. It was about peace, the kind that didn't need applause to exist. Fairfund's new office overlooked the heart of the city, only a few blocks from where I once lived. Sometimes I passed that old building, the faded sign still clinging above the entrance. It reminded me how delicate beginnings can be, and how powerful persistence truly is. The doorman, who still remembered my name, once said, "You've come a long way, Ms. Hale." I smiled and replied, "Far enough to call it home." At home, the air smelled faintly of cedar and coffee. Alex's laughter echoed from the kitchen, blending with soft music from the speakers. I stood by the balcony again, tracing the skyline with my eyes. Dallas no longer looked like the city that had once carried my pain. It appeared smaller, gentler, almost kind. I realized peace doesn't erase the past, it simply stops demanding your attention. That night, I sat by the window, the framed rent receipt glowing under the lamplight. The paper curled slightly at the corners, fragile yet unbroken, much like me. I no longer chased anyone's approval. I had built something steady from the pieces that once shattered me. By the following winter, trouble had found its way to Ryan's doorstep. His name filled the business columns for all the wrong reasons: failed deals, unpaid debts, investors demanding answers. The reports mentioned the same house my father had proudly gifted him years ago, now listed for foreclosure. I didn't turn away when I saw the news on my phone, but I didn't reach out either. Pity had become a language I'd forgotten how to speak. Fairfund was flourishing. The team kept growing, my calendar packed with meetings and flights. One evening, after returning from a Chicago conference, I noticed a black sedan by the front gate. Ryan stood beside it, his suit creased, hair messy, eyes hollow like someone who hadn't rested in days. The guard had called ahead before letting him approach, but I told them to allow it. Some endings, I thought, deserved quiet closure. He smiled faintly when I walked closer. "You look different," he said, glancing toward the glass doors and trimmed lawn. "Looks like Fairfund's been good to you." I gave a small nod and waited. He shifted his weight, cleared his throat, and finally said why he came. "I just need a little help, Aubrey. Just for a while. I'll pay you back. I just need room to breathe." I remembered his 30th birthday, the toast, my father's proud hand on his shoulder, the laughter that followed, and the moment when that same hand pointed at me asking me to cover his mortgage. I'd already learned that silence wasn't weakness, it was control. "Ryan, I said softly. I hope you find your way through this. But I can't be part of it. His face changed, pleading fading into disbelief. You're really doing this? To your own brother? I didn't respond. The wind carried the faint murmur of the lake beyond the yard. When he saw my decision wouldn't change, he shook his head, muttered something about pride, and left without another word. 2 days later, my phone wouldn't stop buzzing. A post from Ryan had gone viral. He wrote about a sister who'd forgotten her roots, attaching a picture of our parents' old house, implying I'd traded family for success. The comments spread faster than I could read them. Some called me heartless, others called me admirable. The noise was endless. Then came my parents' calls. My mother's voice was sharp, layered with disappointment. Aubrey, do you understand how this looks? People are asking questions. You need to fix this. You're ruining our reputation. My father's tone was colder. Do the right thing. He's your brother. I stared at the phone, their voices overlapping until all I heard was static. Alex walked in, searching my face. Do you want me to say something publicly? He asked quietly. I shook my head. No, let them talk. That night, I silenced every notification and opened my laptop. While the internet argued, I reviewed quarterly reports and finished investor documents. The world outside burned with opinions, but my focus stayed unbroken. I'd learned silence could speak louder than any defense. In the weeks that followed, the uproar faded. People moved on to new scandals, new names. Ryan deleted his post, perhaps out of guilt or because no one cared anymore. My parents never apologized, but their calls stopped too. The quiet felt familiar, almost soothing. One night, as I worked late, Alex placed a cup of tea beside me. You're quiet, he murmured. I smiled faintly. I'm realizing quiet doesn't mean powerless. He nodded, understanding. My gaze drifted to the framed rent receipt above my desk. It had survived every season, every storm, every silence. I knew then I didn't need to defend who I'd become. The world could misread my story, twist it, judge it, and still it wouldn't touch the peace I'd built. For the first time, I saw silence not as surrender, but as strength. The kind that doesn't shout, doesn't justify, doesn't beg to be right. It simply endures. That spring, I stepped onto a stage beneath golden lights. The hall shimmered with anticipation. Cameras flashed like sparks as the crowd fell silent. Behind me, the screen glowed with the Fair Home Foundation logo, a vision born from months of late nights, planning, and quiet resolve. It marked the beginning of something greater than any business before it. A $750,000 initiative to provide shelter and education for orphans and abandoned children across Texas. I'd rehearsed the speech countless times, yet as I faced the sea of faces, the words felt less rehearsed, more like a truth long waiting to be spoken. Among the audience, I noticed familiar outlines. My parents sat in the third row, my father's posture still rigid, my mother's hands neatly folded. Ryan sat beside them, wearing the same strange smile I'd seen too often at family events. To everyone else, they looked like proud relatives celebrating success. Only I knew better. The act had simply found a new stage. Alex stood near the front, calm and steady, reminding me to breathe. I began to speak, my voice steady but warm, tracing the journey that brought me here. Fair Home was born from a simple question, I said. What happens to the children who have nowhere to return? The room fell still. I let the silence linger before continuing. Sometimes they aren't just the ones abandoned by strangers. Sometimes they're forgotten by their own families. Sometimes they are not just the ones left behind by strangers. Sometimes they are forgotten by their own families. Murmurs rippled through the audience. The camera light blinked red at the edge of the stage, recording every word. When I was younger, I said slowly, I was told that sacrifice defined worth, that helping meant giving up parts of yourself for others. But over time, I learned something else. I learned that love without fairness becomes control. I learned that silence can be louder than approval. I glanced briefly at the front rows. My father's face had gone still, as if my words pressed against something long buried. Ryan shifted in his seat, avoiding my gaze. I kept my eyes on the lights, not the faces. Years ago, I continued, I was told to pay someone else's mortgage. So I built a roof for those who had none. The hall erupted into applause. Some people stood. The sound rolled through the room like thunder breaking after rain. I stayed still, letting the moment wash over me, without pride, without resentment. On the large screen, the camera caught my father's unmoving expression. His hands rested stiffly on his knees, his jaw set. The applause only grew louder. As the ovation faded, I concluded, Fair Home is not about charity. It's about restoring dignity. Every child deserves more than survival. They deserve safety, choice, and a voice. My last words lingered in the lights before I stepped back from the podium. When the ceremony ended, reporters gathered near the stage, flashes sparking against the gold backdrop. My parents rose slowly, pretending to clap, whispering to those nearby as if nothing had happened. Ryan looked like he wanted to approach, but the crowd formed a wall between us. I turned to Alex, who extended a hand. "Ready?" he asked. I nodded. We exited through a side corridor where the applause faded behind closed doors. The air outside smelled of spring rain and fresh pavement. I didn't look back at the hall or the people still talking inside. Some moments aren't meant to be revisited. As we reached the car, Alex glanced at me. "That line," he said quietly, "about the roof, it was perfect." I smiled faintly. "It wasn't written for them," I said. "It was written for me." Inside the car, the city lights blurred through the window as we drove away. My phone buzzed with messages, congratulations, articles, invitations, but I didn't open any of them. I watched the skyline shrink behind us, the glow of the hall fading into distance. For years, I'd searched for closure through forgiveness, through explanation, through words that never landed. But walking off that stage in silence, I understood something new. Sometimes the truest peace isn't in being heard, but in knowing you no longer need to speak. The morning after the gala, Dallas felt quieter than ever. The city moved slowly beneath a haze of early light, and from the balcony, I could see the lake reflecting a faint silver line of dawn. The papers had already arrived. On the front page of the business section was a familiar headline. Former investor Ryan Hale declared bankrupt. His company had collapsed under unpaid debts. The article ended with a note about liquidation hearings in the spring. Farther down the page, another piece mentioned my parents. They had sold their home and moved out of the neighborhood. Downsizing, as the reporter gently put it. I folded the paper without finishing it. The world had moved on. There was no anger left, only quiet recognition of endings that had finally come full circle. Standing on that balcony, the view that once symbolized distance now felt like closure. The wind was soft, brushing the curtains against the glass. The house behind me was silent except for the faint hum of the espresso machine. Alex had gone for an early run, leaving a note by the counter. "Let's walk later." I smiled at the simplicity of it. Peace, I realized, doesn't always arrive with a grand announcement. Sometimes it slips in quietly and decides to stay. When Alex returned, we walked down the lake path, the one lined with young trees planted after the last big storm. Their branches arched above us, filtering the morning light. He told me about an upcoming investor dinner, but my mind drifted to the idea of freedom. How strange and gentle it felt now. "Freedom used to mean escaping," I said. Alex looked at me curiously. "And now?" "Now it feels more like staying," I smiled. "Staying in my own life." The Fair Home Foundation had grown beyond our expectations. Donations poured in, not just from corporations, but from ordinary people who believed in the mission. Our first housing project had opened in Fort Worth, a cluster of bright, sunlit homes painted in cheerful colors. Every month, I received handwritten letters from the children living there, notes full of misspelled words and warmth. "Thank you for my room. I like the blue walls. I want to help people like you someday." Each letter felt like a fragment of the life I once wished for myself. Safe, steady, unafraid. At work, The days were full, but never heavy. Meetings flowed easily. The halls buzzed with laughter, the genuine kind. I often stayed late, not from duty, but because the hum of progress felt like home. Sometimes my eyes would wander to the framed rent receipt still hanging above my desk. It had survived every stage of my journey, from scarcity to stability, and somehow it meant more now than ever. It reminded me that beginnings don't need permission to matter. That evening, Alex and I sat on the balcony again. The city lights shimmered across the lake like floating stars. He poured 2 glasses of wine. "Do you ever think about them?" he asked. I knew he meant my family. "Sometimes," I said, not with bitterness, just distance. "I think we all became who we were meant to." He nodded, his hand finding mine. "Do you regret any of it?" I thought for a long moment. "No," I said quietly, "because without all of it, I wouldn't know what peace feels like." Later that night, as darkness settled, I walked through the house, turning off each light. The city's glow spilled through the windows, painting soft patterns on the floor. I stopped by the framed letters from the children, some drawings, some crayon hearts, and felt a quiet warmth rise inside me. "This peace was worth every storm," I whispered. It wasn't triumph that filled me, nor pride, just acceptance. The understanding that not every wound needs healing, not every loss requires repair. Sometimes the most powerful resolution is silence, the kind that doesn't come from defeat, but from choosing not to fight anymore. The past had already spoken loudly enough. Now it was my turn to live without needing to respond. Dallas glittered beyond the glass. The skyline reflected like molten gold on the lake. The air outside was cool, almost tender. I leaned against the window, watching the faint ripples on the water. For the first time in years, I felt that my story no longer needed telling. It had already written itself, into the lives I helped rebuild, into the homes standing where there was once emptiness. And that was enough. Silence isn't weakness. It's where dignity grows. Sometimes the only way to heal is to walk away and let consequences speak for themselves. You don't owe anyone the version of you that keeps them comfortable. You owe yourself the freedom to be at peace. Thank you for listening to the end of my story. If you've ever belonged to a family that asked too much and gave too little, share what you learned in the comments. Someone out there might need your voice today. Let's build a place where silence turns into strength.